Okay, I'm going to again move further into Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and the Angel Out Ahead. I'm still in chapter 6, Ta'wil and Prophetic Philosophy, and today it's in the second part, which is called The Word and the World. And so again, it's quite sort of difficult to summarize the context here. Basically, I'm sort of trying to understand the relevance of imaginal practice, and how imaginal practice may be able to help with sort of the development of the soul, sort of conceived in Jungian individuation terms, or our spiritual development, moral development. How is imaginal practice relevant to that? And how can imaginal practice help us to sort of progressively clarify the distinction between fantasy or imagination and the imaginal? And that's kind of the only context I can give. What else would I say? Yeah, that we're also talking about sort of Heideggerian hermeneutics. So we're talking about a sacred reading. We're talking about the sort of phenomenology of prophetic philosophy, and how, like, the importance of revelation, I guess, in I would say, I don't know. I mean, what can you say about the importance of revelation? It seemed important to a lot of people, and I'm not about to explain why revelation is important. What I'm going to say here is that in this context, in the context of those topics, which again I've discussed repeatedly throughout, like the invitations to go back to, at least, 5 or so episodes ago, there's this cosmology of sort of ascent and descent, and then we're reimagining, um, some quite old problems, such as we were talking about Genesis last time, talking about the nature of sin, of redemption, and like that. With this, is in the context of this Islamic cosmology that Corbin is pushing. And today, it's about what he wants to talk about, sort of, again, quote, the consequences for the interpretation of the status of the world after the fall, which we did last time, and then the consequences of the incarnation of God in Christ and of our understanding of time, space, and matter are profound. So he wants to talk about here the word and the world. And let's see what turns up as a result of that. I know that wasn't very much context. That's okay. Cheetham says, the word and the world. Islamic cosmology is ahistorical and based on a mythic sense of time. The meaning of history and of the sacred book, that is the Quran, has nothing to do with the unfolding of events in time, and everything to do with what Corbin calls hierohistory, like hierophany, hierohistory, with events in the eternal time of the soul. Again, so pausing, again, we have the notion that we've been sort of cut off from an eternal sense of time, and that the mythic sense is deeply involved in that. Work with archetypes, work with the imaginal, work with the soul can restore our sense for the eternal, and that could be profoundly helpful to us, profoundly beneficial. And that, let's say, historically speaking, for example, in Islamic cosmology, prophetic philosophy, for example, of reading the Quran, is to sort of ascend to the original time, is sort of how they do that, or at least one way. Continuing, for Corbin, it is this conception of the meaning of history and time that is the most important difference between the official Christianity of the councils and Islamic spirituality. Islam has simply never had to confront the problems of historical consciousness. Okay, so if I pause again, one of the most important points here is that this access to the eternal is, in a way, what confers meaning upon profane time or chronological time. So there's a way that our sense of meaninglessness in life is sort of, according to these people, deeply tied to our loss of our sense for the eternal, and the practices that can support us to recover that sense. For example, including prophetic philosophy, sacred reading, and so on. We also had the observation that because Islam has never had to confront the problems of historical consciousness, that might be a kind of problem. Like, what will it do when it encounters such problems, or how can it help with those problems? We're trying to find that out. Corbin correlates the rise of historical consciousness in the West with the doctrine of the Incarnation, the appearance of God in a body at a moment in time. In his view, the consequences of the official dogma of the Incarnation and the resulting interpretation of the relation between God and creation are immense. Corbin states, the coming of historical consciousness is concomitant with the formation of dogmatic consciousness. In the official form given to it by the definitions of the councils, the fundamental dogma of Christianity, that of the Incarnation, is the most characteristic symptom of this. Because the Incarnation is a unique and irreversible fact. It takes its place in a series of material facts. God in person was incarnated in a moment in history. This happened within the framework of a set chronology. There is no more mystery. Consequently, esotericism or esotericism, the doctrines of the hidden meanings, is no longer necessary. Such an incarnation of God in person in empirical history, and consequently the historical consciousness that goes hand in hand with it, are unknown to the traditional Orient. Okay, so obviously there's a lot in that quote from Corbin. So first of all, if I try to break that down a bit, I think it would be reasonable to say that the formation of dogmatic consciousness took place long before this coming of historical consciousness. I could certainly see that a sort of radical overemphasis on this historical consciousness and the absence of our sense of the eternal could sort of exacerbate the dogma or go along with the rise of dogma, in the sense of this imbalance toward the literal interpretation rather than the symbolic. And again, this loss of the imaginal deeply cuts off the subject from the object and the abstract from the sensory and so on. And we get this rigidifying, fragmenting, ossifying that goes along with the loss of imagination, loss of the imaginal, loss of mythic consciousness, loss of the eternal. But that doesn't mean that those things are causally connected in quite this way. I don't think it's fair to blame historical consciousness for all of dogma. I wouldn't want to deny that the doctrine of the Incarnation is dogmatic in a way, but I'm not sure that it would be fair to say that that doctrine is only dogmatic. You know, what do I mean by that? Well, people may believe that God was incarnated in Christ for reasons other than dogma, and we could think about what those are, like their belief, the testimony of people who are around at that time, um, rather than just strict adherence to the dogma. I think, I mean, again, I don't want to. I'm trying not to say too much here because I'm not in a position to say too much. But it does seem to me that I do get a sense that when we feel that sort of God was incarnated in this person, it does result in this sort of loss of emphasis on the mystery, which are considered sort of no longer necessary. I can get a sense for that, but I also know that, I mean, there are Christian mysteries and they haven't sort of disappeared or gone away just because of this doctrine. So I'm just sort of conscious of the straw manning tendency. And then sort of just because the incarnation of God in person in empirical history is sort of unknown to the traditional Orient in the way that's being described, that doesn't mean it's not in a way correct or valid. Like there could be things that we gain from believing that. There could be, might be new information, the the good news, as it were. But anyway, that's just sort of notes on what Corbin is saying. Certainly, Corbin feels that that doctrine didn't really help. Let's try and see if we can explore why he feels that. Cheetham continues. The crucial fact is that the matter into which God is incarnated, in both space and the time in which this matter by definition must exist. So let me repeat that again. The crucial fact is that the matter into which God is incarnated, and both the space and the time in which this matter by definition must exist, are all exoteric, public, and revealed. The official dogma of the incarnation requires the literal space-time that was to be finally given an explicit and exclusively quantitative formulation only much later. Okay, so I have to mention here that I think, like, if I'm understanding rightly from earlier, we saw that in many of these doctrines, an understanding of the whole purpose of this kind of practice, or sort of restoring the balance that existed in paradise, right, was to get this, again, sort of opponent processing dynamic feedback loop, reciprocal opening dynamic between esoteric and exoteric. And it was understood that the exoteric, and in a sense, what's being talked about as the public, the revealed, the actual, the manifest, they're all, this participation in those is necessary in order to get to the esoteric. So I don't see why God being incarnated in that exoteric would be an issue, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be an issue. Perhaps it would be. Like, why is it a problem that that God is incarnated in the exoteric, is what I'm asking. Again, Cheetham said that the official dogma of the incarnation requires the literal space-time that was to be finally given an explicitly and exclusively quantitative formulation only much later. But in a way, this feels to me sort of like begging the question, like, isn't that's what they're saying, right? It's like, yes, in this literal space-time. So I'm going to give the footnote here. It's a short one, and then we will continue, seeing if we can find some more answers. Cheetham says, a countercurrent to this dogmatic formulation exists. Corbin points to Nicholas Erasme, who in the 14th century proposed a geometry of the intensities of existence, which is often regarded as a prelude to analytical geometry, but which Corbin compares to the ontology of Mulla Sadra. Corbin writes of Erasme, quote, he considers the corporeal quality as being made up of a double corporeality. There is the one resulting from the extension of the subject in the three dimensions of space, and there is another which is only imagined and which results from the intensity of the quality multiplied by the multiplicity of surfaces which one can detect in the inner nature of a subject. I'm going to repeat that. This guy, Erasme, he considered the corporeal quality as being made up of a double corporeality. There is the one corporeality resulting from the extension of the subject in the three dimensions of space. And there is another corporeality, which is only imagined and which results, quote, from the intensity of the quality multiplied by the multiplicity of surfaces, which one can detect in the inner nature of a subject. Okay, so he's talking about a sort of an imagined corporeality resulting from a certain quality which has variations of intensity. And that quality with its variations of intensity is, quote, multiplied by the many different surfaces which one can detect within the inner nature of a subject. Complicated. Then Corbin says, this fourth dimension completes itself in the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. Somewhat comporting with Jung, but anyway, let's go on. He said, we might compare this intuition to the claim of Ortega y Gasset. Quote, so many things fail to interest us simply because they don't find in us enough surfaces on which to live. And what we have to do then is to increase the number of planes in our mind so that a much larger number of themes can find a place in it at the same time. In these ideas, we can see the outline of an entire philosophy of education. I mean, this is reminding me of Michael Levin from the modern day. It's very cool. It's a kind of geometry of interiority. I mean, the connections there to memory, to mnemonics through geometry, geometry of minds. I'll have to leave that there and continue. Cheetham continues. And he was again talking about the doctrine of the incarnation in sort of literal space-time. And he says, this Corbin contrasts in the strongest terms with the Docetism of Gnostic religion. Docetism was the doctrine denounced by the early Christian councils that Christ was not fully flesh and blood, that he was merely an appearance. So it's the idea that Christ's sort of spiritual body is in a way more important and that he didn't really have a physical body. And so again, the sort of the doctrine of the incarnation is sort of the opposite of this Docetism, and Corbin is pointing this out. From the point of view of what was to become orthodoxy, redemption was only possible through the full humanity of Christ, who at the same time must be fully God. But from the point of view that Corbin defends, this doctrine of the incarnation, quote, precludes a unique and personal relationship between God manifesting as a person and the unique individual to whom he manifests, and on whom he thereby confers personhood. Okay, so that's a kind of, in a way, it's an empirical question. I mean, I know that's in a way, kind of problematic way of putting it, but Corbin's basic claim is that, again, from the point of view of the orthodoxy, when God is sort of both fully human and fully God, then redemption is possible. Whereas Corbin is saying, no, if God is sort of incarnated, then we're not actually able to get a unique and personal relationship between God as person and the unique individual. And so the question would be, can we verify that objection? Can we verify the claim? Like, what is actually possible for us? It's still not quite clear what Corbin means, but we're going to try and explore a little bit more to see if he will reveal what he means. What Cheetham says, again, from the point of view that Corbin defends, this doctrine of the incarnation precludes a unique and personal relationship between God manifesting as a person and the unique individual to whom he manifests, and on whom he thereby confers personhood. So the point would seem to imply that this doctrine of the incarnation would still allow God to manifest as a person, but our relationship with that would not be unique. And that in consequence, our personhood would in some way be voided. or not able to be fully conferred. So again, it's talking, the question would be about the quality of the relationship with the incarnated God in Christ. Does it need to be a unique relationship in order for us to be fully persons? And if so, why? And if not, why not? So what is required for personhood would be a good question. Cheetham continues, this is the most profound characteristic of the West, that we have lost the phenomenology that accompanies the original meaning of the word docetism, and thus have cut ourselves off from the foundation of religious experience itself. A Docetic Gnostic understanding of this primary personal relation would put the worlds back into order by revealing the necessity of the imaginal world. Okay, again, we are about to get another long quote from Corbin, but just before that, so the point here is that so I guess Corbin feels that we've sort of lost something in pushing the dogma of the incarnation. And so he feels in some way that having a unique connection to the person of God is what's crucial. And he feels that in some way the doctrine of the incarnation precludes that, doesn't allow for that. And therefore, in some way, that our personhood is that we're cut off from that. And so it seems that, and so there's a disagreement about how gnosis is possible, it seems to me. Because I think the Christians would probably say, just because God is incarnated in Christ as a human, that's what makes a personal connection with him possible in some way. That's what makes direct experience of relationship with him possible. And so there's just a disagreement about how gnosis actually works, how it is actually possible. Again, I'm sort of blundering through a whole lot of different landmines, but yeah, it seems that Corbin's focus is on this primary personal relationship to gnosis itself, and that he feels that this doctrine of incarnating in humanity, in the body, prevents that in some way. And so he feels that this an understanding that is more of again a primary personal relationship that is more Gnostic, more oriented to the esoteric in some way, would quote put the worlds back into order. Quote, by revealing the necessity of the mundus imaginalis, by revealing the importance of the imaginal world. And I guess I can see a bit of what he means. Again, there's a sort of implication that, oh, Christ has already been incarnated, so it's fine. Like it's taken care of, don't worry. And I think Corbin's idea is that like, no, via the exoteric, we can go up to the esoteric through our personal connection, through theophany, through imaginal practice. And maybe that isn't being foregrounded in the dogma. And he's concerned for that. Now we get this long quote from Corbin, which I will attempt to break down. Okay, Corbin states, and I might read the whole thing, it's long, and then I'll maybe try and break it down. Let's see. He says, between God manifested as a person, biblically the angel of the face, and the person that it promotes to the rank of person, hang on, sorry. I have to try that again. So difficult, like the first sentence is like impossible. So, okay, so again, he was talking about a primary personal relation to the sort of personal face of God as theophany. And he feels that that is what's important in quote, putting the world back into order by revealing the necessity of the imaginal world. And then he says, this relation between God manifested as a person, biblically as the angel of the face, and the person that it promotes to the rank of person in revealing itself to it is fundamentally an existential relation, never a dogmatic one. Okay, I have to pause already because it's going to be easier that way. That I feel that that's deeply true and important, right? So the idea that the when okay, so there's like two relata in the relation, right? One of them is God's manifestation as a person, right? And then there's the relation between them, and then what happens, let's say, is that we are revealed to ourselves. So there's a way, again, through agape, sort of God in a way shows us who we are. We come to realize who we are. And another way of talking about that is that we're sort of promoted to the rank of person. So we're revealed to ourselves. We become people that way. And again, this is deeply Heideggerian in a sense, that our being is sort of aletheically unveiled. And again, Corbin says that this is existential. It's an existential relation, not a dogmatic one. I guess I'm like, okay, what is a dogmatic relation? I just thought of I sort of thought all existential relations were existential, but like wouldn't if we were being dogmatic about it, wouldn't that dogma be pointing to the existential quality? And maybe I'm just sort of naive about how the church works. Anyway, I would certainly agree with Corbin. He continues, it cannot be expressed as a dogma, but as a dokima, literally Dokhema, dokima. Okay, so he's identifying a quality of this relation and the quote unquote effect that it's supposed to produce in some way, that it actually can't be expressed in dogma. And again, that sort of seems like a very obvious point that maybe we need to clarify because we're so silly, but it's like, yes, it's something to be lived, it's existential, something to be participated in. It's not something to assert as a belief. But what does he mean by dokima? The two terms derive from the same Greek word dokeo, dokeo, signifying all at once to appear, to show itself as, and believe, think, admit. That's interesting. I mean, in terms of signifying all at once to appear and to show itself, it's quite similar to Heidegger's phenomenology, the showing, the shining forth as it is, letting something be as it is. But to believe, to think, to admit, all in the same term. This is the root of both dogma and dokima. There's a quality there of admitting. When we admit something, we literally let it in, right? But we allow that it's the case. And the idea being that when we admit something, we're letting it in from somewhere, meaning from outside. And it's in a way, it's not just I mean, I think we really see the consequences of the modern condition, right? Because when we just believe something, when we just think it, there's a way that we're not admitting it deeply. We're not really letting it sink in to us. Quote, the dokima, as distinct from the dogma, marks the line of interdependence between the form of that which manifests itself and that to whom it manifests. Okay, so this seems to be, I would talk about sort of, again, the line between yin and yang in a way. It's like, well, imagine that it's God and Adam, or like the personal God and our person. Well, there's a kind of line of interdependence between them, and the dokima supposedly marks that. Hence its importance, perhaps. Again, he's talking about the relationship between. Quote, it is this same correlation that can be called docesis. Unfortunately, it is from this that the routine accumulated over the centuries of history in Occidental dogmas has derived the term Docetism, synonym of the phantasmic, the irreal, the apparent. Okay, so again, Corbin is just sort of suggesting a diagnosis of deep change. Sort of, what would you say? Like it's what's that term? Linguistic drift or semantic drift. But it's not exactly that either. It's like the change in the meaning of these terms over different centuries, going along with shifts in our consciousness, right? And so this term docesis had to do with the line of interdependence between that which manifests, let's say, as personal God, and that to whom it manifests. And Corbin feels that this relation, that interdependent line, is really important, like is the sine qua non of this personal connection, right? And he's saying that in some way, well, he likes the docetic version of this. So he calls this in a way that's connected with that quote dokima, that line of interdependence. It's related to Docetism, this which is this Gnostic understanding of this primary personal relation that sort of affords gnosis, affords self-transformation. But then he feels that the term dokesis was in a way became degraded, and it started to mean something which is different than what I was just describing. And he feels that it started to mean the phantasmic, the irreal, or the apparent. And he says, so it is necessary to reinvigorate the primary sense. That which is called Docetism is in fact the theological critique, or rather the theosophical critique of religious consciousness. Okay, I'll keep trying to unpack more of the quote here, but it seems to be, and I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but I don't think I am. It seems to be that this kind of docetism, again, it's like, oh, Christ didn't have a real physical body. It's a way of, in a way, talking about the connection, the relation, the interdependence between, let's say, us as person and God. And maybe the idea is that sort of when we are cut off from that, when we don't have access to that in the like if the connection is instead to the material historical Christ, and that's what's emphasized, which is maybe what he's pointing to, then it's maybe not a connection to the higher or the spiritual Christ. That's what he's sort of feeling, I think. And hence that term, docetism, comes to be in a way pejorative. It comes to refer to what is phantasmic or irreal or the apparent, which is in a way regarded as not important or sort of irrelevant or unreal, yeah, rather than gnosis. And so his diagnosis is to sort of try and recover the original meaning, what was meant by Docetism. Can we get back to the primary sense of what that meant? And then he says something which is confusing, which we're trying to understand. And he says, that which is called Docetism is in fact the theological critique, or rather the theosophical critique of religious consciousness. Okay, that's actually very helpful. I can understand this in a new way. So this Docetism, where it came to be regarded as pejorative, right? Oh, it's only Docetism. It's just phantasmic. It's just irreal. It's just apparent. this would go along with theology, right, which is distinct from gnosis. So theology, so again, Jung, religion is a defense against the experience of God. So where the direct personal connection was regarded as sort of taboo or overwhelming or only for the few, well, the docetic or docetist sort of positions that would push this form of gnosis or religious consciousness would be critiqued by the explicit theology, the fallen theology. And that's what he's pointing to. He says, a critique which, questioning what is visible to the believer, but invisible to the non-believer, questions the nature and causes of this invisibility. Okay, there's a couple of claims in there which are sort of implied. But again, the idea would be that this, again, original sort of Gnostic, Docetist personal connection with the revealed God involves a sort of, again, personal belief, a believer, and it involves connection to something which is quote unquote invisible to the non-believer. And I think from this point of view, we can see why it may be hard for other people to believe and may come with some suspicion. It's like, hey, what is this crazy guy talking about? This personal connection with God. There would be a lot of jealousy, that was implied because people may want for themselves this personal connection with God. It might seem like someone was claiming a superiority, like, oh, I have this personal connection, right? And it may also be the case that, if we lose the collective sense making, right? So I was pointing out that sort of personal stuff can sort of get in the way and the sort of ego and hierarchy business that could result in this theological critique. But we can also see that if one elite person, if someone who's more visually inclined or more inclined toward gnosis, well, if they lose the, again, sort of independent verification that goes along with community, that we can also that there are consensually validatable properties of things. Like, look, the reason that we call this a cup is because when I look at it, a mug, um, it serves as a mug, and we can sort of agree on, you could say, both its objective sensory features and also its purpose, its function. Um, Generally speaking, I mean, you can get creative people that really use stuff in a different way, but that's sort of anomalous, as in not most of the time. As in, for all intents and purposes, to everyone, this is a mug. And we lose that. And so I would say that in a way, the burden of proof is upon the Gnostic. Like, I can understand why, because you need really such delicate sociology and psychology to be able to hold the existence of the minority that can actually have this personal connection. Like, it's in a way, it's perfectly understandable why there would be this theological critique, even if we can understand that it's not ideal. And if we don't understand, if we don't appreciate that, then it becomes very easy to just sort of blame the dogmatists and blame the theologians. Oh, they don't get it, you know. And it's like, no, no, there's a lot of subtlety, that human subtlety that's going on here. Corbin continues. I'll just repeat a little bit. He said, so it is necessary to reinvigorate the primary sense. That which is called Docetism is in fact the theological critique, or rather the theosophical critique of religious consciousness. Again, oh, it's just Docetism. That's critiquing personal connection to the revealed God. A critique which questioning what is visible to the believer but invisible to the non-believer, questions the nature and causes of this invisibility. Because it might just be made up, it might just be imaginary, and that's a fair criticism. He continues, nature and causes which hold to the event, which has place and consists in the correlation of which we speak. That have their place neither in the world of sensible perception nor in the abstract world of understanding. Another world is necessary, therefore, to us to assure ontologically the clear right of this relation, which is not logical, conceptual, dogmatic, but a theophanic relation, constitutive of a visionary realism, where the apparent becomes apparition. Okay, gosh, so you can see how dense Corbin is, right? There's so much in here. So I have to break this down a little bit. So again, we're sort of talking about this relation between the sort of the personal revealed God and our person that can be conferring of personhood, that can allow us to be persons. And the Gnostic has the personal sense for this. And the theological uh, critique of this is to question something that sort of that personal connection, which is visible to the believer, but not visible to whoever doesn't believe. And I was sort of pointing out earlier why that's a reasonable critique in some ways. But then we're sort of elaborating on this. And he was saying that it's not just the believer that gets critiqued, but it's the, quote, the nature and causes of the invisibility. And so I think the connection here would be if to the degree that the Gnostic has a sort of event, right, a sort of state-bounded experience has happened to Eckhart, to Boheme, you know, it's this there was something that happened, like it was shown to me in this moment of revelation, right? To the degree that it's an event which is in place, that's again the Heideggerian thing. There's this sort of there's a moment of being more deeply in place, in a way. Those qualities can be questioned because if it's not something that's sort of going on all the time, right? Then it's harder to get a sense for it because it's in a way it's the sort of thing, again, Gnostic experience, right? Where you sort of had to be there. And we're talking about that kind of experience, right? It's if you weren't there and then you just go along to all your theological mates at church and you say, oh, I had this moment of like profound connection with God and he sort of happened in this place, then everyone's going to be like, that's crazy, man. We don't believe you. I mean, sorry to, but like that's what I'm getting here. And then further, not only that, not only that these kinds of, again, personal connections can be precipitated in moments of experience that are state bounded. And again, I think, at least temporally speaking, time bounded. Um, they're the sort of experiences, especially when they're sort of experienced in the Gnostic way through what Corbin calls the imaginal. Well, it's something that's properly not of the shared world of perception, and it's not of the abstract world either. It's in the province of what Corbin would call the imaginal. It's a different kind of experience. It's not it's not an abstract sort of thing, and it's not something that's sort of mutually sensible in the perceptible way. And that's again why it's so difficult, is because if we don't if we're not practicing together, if we're not, let's say, trained in that skill, the skill, the practice of the imaginal, then it's going to be even harder to appreciate what the one weirdo who has a Gnostic experience is going to be talking about. Much easier to criticize it, which is why Corbin says another world is necessary, therefore, to us to assure ontologically the clear right of this relation. So here, the implication is that the importance of us practicing imaginally is that we actually, in a way, unlock or at least develop, cultivate the skill, the capacity for, or opening to theophany and a theophanic relation. And especially if that were to sort of, again, go along with the Heideggerian stuff about being more deeply who we are, being more deeply present here and sort of homemaking and dwelling and all that stuff, then we can see why that can be profoundly valuable, apart from all the other reasons to practice imaginally. And so this is why, all this stuff is why Corbin feels that it's really important to emphasize this sort of, again, docetic Gnostic understanding of a primary personal relation. So it seems that for Corbin, there's a direct connection between the imaginal, imagination, the imaginal world, and this, and again, and the revelation of theophany, right? And our personhood. All of that is going together. Complicated. And again, it's sort of the same themes all the way through that I'm not disagreeing with anything that Corbin is saying, but I feel that there are a few biases and that I'm disagreeing as to how do we deal with it. And that's where Viveki in part is so helpful. Cheetham continues. In Corbin's analysis, Christian and post-Christian history move always in exterior, literal, material time, in the temporality characteristic of quantitative space. And this space-time has no vertical dimension. So I feel that's a straw man. I mean, I get his point, but I think, look, I mean, I don't know. I think there's a couple of things there. One of them is that yeah, we still have the Christian mysteries, and it's like I think many people would sort of, from the Christian point of view, disagree and say, no, we do have this deep interiority, there's deep symbolism, there's deep non-materiality, and deep access to the eternal, and question Corbyn's analysis. And that's fine. I think we can still see a lot of value in what Corbyn is pointing to. And it may also be worth noticing that there is some truth to what he is saying about Christianity in the sense that to the degree that we emphasize the exterior, the literal and the material and temporality, there may be a tendency to forget about the other side, at least for some. And that could come with real consequences. Vice versa, to Corbyn, the point would be, yes, but there are also certain affordances that are unlocked. We gain something by conceiving of Christ in this way, of God in this way. Let's continue with Cheetham, who said, and this space-time has no vertical dimension. The now of this space-time has only the dimensions of the vanishing moment, emerging from the causal past and disappearing forever into the future. That is to say, there is nothing present. In the space-time of literal matter, The past is past. The future is not yet. And the present is absence. And so there really is nothing. Nihilism, the abyss, the attack of Ahriman. Okay, we would have to say a couple of things there. I mean, I won't spend too long on it, but I'll just say that again, the Christians would probably disagree and say that there is a verticality and that they're deeply connected to that despite existing in our space-time. We could also say that that model of linear time is profoundly helpful and beneficial in many ways, that it's afforded so much of what we now take to be, I don't know, sort of everything that again undergirds our life. So it might have qualities that are beneficial, that model of time, that are not being mentioned. And then it says, yeah, he's saying that there's nothing present. And when we talked earlier in this sort of stuff about the act of presence and so on, and I was sort of happy to with the argument that, well, it's the present is referring to a past which is not here, and the future which is not here. But I don't get the inference that the present is also absence. But maybe I just misunderstood that part. I don't know. But in any case, we can see how what can result from only having access to this version of space-time can tend toward nihilism. And I think Viveki and others, for example, The Blind Spot, that book, have pointed to that. But again, I'm not comfortable with it being reduced in that direction. And I'm also not like one way of understanding that is the attack of Ahriman. But you want to be really careful about mythologizing everything. But yes, perhaps there is something to learn about sort of Ahrimanic tendencies and how to account for them, as well as Luciferian tendencies. Cheetham continues. Western secular utopian eschatologies of all sorts, including Marxism, the utopias of science, science fiction, and capitalist economics, are all the result of the secularization of this Christian historical consciousness. They all seek salvation from nothing in the in that which is to come. They all seek salvation from nothing in that which is to come. Since there is only the not yet, they're all always of the future and have their public place in literal time. Look, that's a fair criticism as per sort of Jamie Wheel and others. The sort of the rapture ideologies through varieties of Christianity are running rampant all over the world. And there's definitely truth to a lot of that. We also sort of see, I mean, look, the belief in the sort of life after death and a sort of orientation towards that in the two world mythology sense is not unique to Christianity. And there are, you know, branches of Islam that are pushing something similar, but that maybe Corbin's not talking about those. But anyway, let's continue without getting too hung up. Quote, the two radically different cosmologies and the kinds of consciousness they require, the historical and the Gnostic, are not only in conflict but mutually exclusive. And develop from wholly incompatible formations of the soul. We now get a quote from Corbin. Again, it's a short one, but I'm not well, we would have to check if this is the case. Like, again, we've gained so much from understanding cosmology and history in this way, and not only is it going to take a long time and be quite difficult for us to get out of it, but there's a lot that we've gained. And I feel it's a sort of mistake to say, oh, here's the problem. We have to sort of leave this behind. I don't know. I mean, it's definitely got something to do with it, but is it really true that it's inherently incompatible, that they're mutually exclusive? Is there a reason? Like, can we imagine? Can we imagine is what I'm saying. Can we imagine ways that they could go together, the historical and the Gnostic? And wouldn't that would that not comport with sort of exoteric and esoteric, the historical and the Gnostic? And if that were the case, then I think what I would understand is that in order to get to the Gnostic and its realization, that the historical was actually necessary and valuable and helpful. Or there at least there are ways that it can be. I mean, and I think we see that, for example, through Viveki. I mean, science can really help us to have good reasons why and understand why certain practices are going to help and certain are not. And we can, sort of with intention work for the sake of the future in a way. Like, hey, I'm going to decide to build an ecology of practices with a community of practitioners, and it's going to take me a while to do that. But because I have a because it's going to happen in the future, and that's okay. But I get it, right? There's also in a way that we're always going towards something that's not here yet, that we find it difficult to be here now. I think what I would say to me, it's a kind of pendulum, and we can maybe instantiate different practices that can restore our access to the eternal, the non-temporal, to the Gnostic. And I don't at the moment see why that should come at the expense of our sense for the historical, but it's possible that it could. Let's hope to find out. Corbin states, perhaps one could say that the aptitude to perceive forms in irreversible chronological succession, to situate them in a moment of this succession and explain them as a function of this movement, is in inverse proportion to the aptitude for seeing them and situating them in space, in a space, that is, which is no longer physical, quantitative, and homogeneous, and to explain them by their rank in a qualitative, permanent, and hierarchic space. Okay. So essentially what he's saying is that there are different aptitudes. What do we mean by an aptitude here? Defined as a sort of natural ability to do something, an aptitude, or suitability or fitness, aptitude of expression. It's apt. And so to have an aptitude is to sort of be, in a way, prepared for something, to be able to do something. And so he's sort of saying that there are two different aptitudes, and they're in a way modes of perception. And there's a way in which each of them is imaginal. And so there's a way I think I could understand that there's a way that this perception of this sort of irreversible chronological succession, that this is in a way colonizing the imaginal space. I mean, it's put a pretty pejorative tone to it, but the idea would be that there is a sort of imaginative faculty, right? You can only be wearing one pair of glasses at a time. And so the idea would be Corbin's kind of trying to say, hey, we've been wearing this one pair of glasses, and if you want to try and put on this other pair of glasses, which he's pointing us to, then you can't wear both. And that's true. And then what we would say is, as per Viveki, can we practice the capacity to take on and off? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but it really makes the point, right? Can we practice being able to shift between different stories, different lenses, different frameworks, different perspectives. Because the idea being that it is that we can rationally and reasonably believe that it is better to be able to swap between them as is needed, rather than doubling down on one. And that may be questionable. Like it that may not be the case. It's kind of like not all lenses are equally helpful. It's kind of like, well, you can try and give an example of like, well, great, Sam, like, oh, having more perspectives is better. Well, like, does it help to be able to see things as the Nazis did? And I think I would probably double down and say there is probably something helpful about seeing things as the Nazis did, so as to be able to connect with people who are like that and then help them out of their, bullshit. And then, but also to help oneself. So for example, again, I think I really do believe that because I think there are many people in such crazy positions, and if you just sort of get caught in, for example, the left and right thing, let's say, then what we're missing actually is the capacity to be able to take up the opposite point of view of the people that we don't like the most. Anyway, I'll leave that there. I've made my point. Cheetham continues. And Corbin thinks they're mutually incompatible, but Cheetham says, a true prophetic philosophy is based on the ever-present possibility of the eruption of the meaning of the word into the soul of the believer in the present, in the form of a spiritual birth of gnosis. Again, a true prophetic philosophy is based on the ever-present possibility of the eruption of the meaning of the word into the soul of the believer in the present, in the form of a spiritual birth of gnosis. The meaning of the moment is just its flowering upward into eternity. The negation of the significance of exterior time is the hallmark of esoteric religion. The negation of the significance of exterior time is the hallmark of esoteric religion. So that's all fine. Again, I won't say too much. We're about to get another quote from Corbin. I would simply say that, yes, there may be a connection between sort of gnosis, or moments of insight, awakening, right, spiritual birth, and this is important. We could question how effective sort of prophetic philosophy is in realizing that. Um, we can, so sort of if you're stuck reading the text all the time, then you're not going to get there. But it's conceived differently here. And so yes, it can give deep meaning to moments, this possibility, but it may not be the case. I think that like the fact that exterior time or sort of chronological, linear time is negated in significance is not necessarily a good thing. Like the fact that it may be the hallmark of esoteric religion, is that desirable? I don't know. Corbin says, such a prophetic philosophy moves in the dimension of a pure theophanic historicity. In the inner time of the soul, external events, cosmologies, the histories of the prophets, are perceived as the history of the spiritual man. Thus, it obliterates the historical trend with which our epoch is obsessed. Prophetic philosophy looks for the meaning of history not in horizons, that is, not by orienting itself in the latitudinal sense of a linear development, but vertically, by a longitudinal orientation, quote, extending from the celestial pole to the earth. In the transparency of the heights or depths in which the spiritual individuality experiences the reality of its celestial counterpart, its lordly dimension, its second person, its thou. Okay, so he's sort of talking about the connection between theophany and the verticality on the sort of religious or spiritual direction. And to me, I've decided that I kind of like it. Like I kind of get it now in a way that I didn't before. Of like, in a way, the whole point is about the development of the soul and about, bringing the vertical, the upper and lower into better alignment and sort of living more from that higher place, kind of like that. And it's kind of not about, in a way, growing or developing. So it's to get somewhere in the future. It's kind of not why we're here. So I get that. And I get how it comports with the sort of the axis mundi, the pole of the world, and in a way that there's a kind of binding between the celestial and the earthly that is both deeply personal in terms of the sort of upper and lower aspects of the soul, or the soul and the divine double, could say. And also, but that's the kind of microcosm, and it's kind of the same at a macrocosmic level where the earth itself is sort of the lower pole in a way. And so I get the reorientation. And it's profound, like it's a profound remembering for us to remember that. And I do see how so much of our historicity and sort of linearity is because we've forgotten that. We've forgotten the direction that we're supposed to be pushing or going. I think what I would say briefly is that we sort of have to find a way for these to go together, I think. And I think like we can definitely see that there's truth to the sort of profound forgetting of being that's resulted in our disconnection from the vertical. And if we can reorient in that way, I think that's profoundly beneficial and valuable, right? But I think again, it's a sort of like if we sort of replace that, like if that comes at the sort of expense of our historicity, then I do think of that as a great loss in a way. And I would also say that like it's sort of fine to be I really do think that we need both. And there's a way that like again, if we're sort of not we might be oriented to the esoteric or to the vertical, but then there's a sort of question of the how question. How do we do that? How do we do the gnosis thing? And again, my understanding with reference to the text from earlier is that it was via the exoteric and that we understood this quite clearly through the Islamic Sufism that he himself was talking about. And if that's the case, then I think we can rationally and reasonably sort of plan for the future and say, hey, well, what we want to be doing is developing, let's say, these ecologies of practices with communities of practitioners in a place, with sustainable community and like that. And I think all of that is designed to sort of afford and allow for gnosis. And but yeah, I don't know. So there's a way that, and I think that kind of a mindset, that kind of an approach can be profoundly helpful for the sake of gnosis, for the sake of realization, and not need to, like far from foreclosing it could help to bring it about. But I think, again, what I would emphasize is like not getting stuck in any one point of view and being able to practice the flexibility of going between different points of view. Anyway, I've maybe talked it to death at this point, so we'll keep going because there's only a couple pages. Cheetham says, the intensification of being as the goal of gnosis can have no ontological foundation without this vertical dimension. We'd probably agree anyway. An historical consciousness entirely bound by material causality, is therefore incompatible with spirituality. The cause of the hermeneutic vision, the cause of the hermeneutic vision originates in the imaginal world, not bounded by quantitative space and time, in a realm not subject to the laws operative there. The time of the soul, of the sacred, is qualitatively other, as is the space. The time and space of the soul. And in the end, perhaps, the two are not easy to differentiate. So it seems like what we're getting here, again, is the sense that the sense of quantitative space and time that we have is in a way derived from the imaginal. It's very hard to get that because we're so stuck within it, but it's like it really is a story. It really is a way of looking at things. It's not sort of inherently given by quote unquote the way that things are. So if we can grok the sense that things are grounded in the imaginal, even that lens, the scientific lens, let's say, then that can help. But it's so hard to get that. And then, okay, the further idea that the sort of time and space of the soul are sort of, again, qualitatively other and maybe hard to differentiate, not easy to. Then he says, quote, the nurse of all things, the nurse of all things in the Timaeus is perhaps both time and space, or the space out of which time is born. So to me, that's the sort of great mother mythology stuff. The time and space are deeply connected through sort of with fate, with the great mother, with the spider, um, the conditions of our time and space, the human condition. Um, it's the category of the void, the emptiness, the nurse, which is also the mother. The, yeah, I won't go on about it. Continues. For the ancient Persians, Zervan is sometimes space, sometimes time. Again, for the ancient Persians, Zervan is sometimes space, sometimes time. And even in the great cosmogonic myth of modern physics, the primordial eruption of being gives birth to space and time together. Okay, and so there's a kind of equivalence drawn between sort of the space and time of the soul, and the Timaeus, as in the nurse as a sort of mother of both space and time, or perhaps the nurse of all things is both space and time, or the space out of which time is born, and sort of the equivalent Persian idea or myth is Zervan as sometimes space, sometimes time, and this is sort of again equivalent in some way to the Big Bang, giving birth to space and time. And now I'm going to try and remind us who Zervan was, with reference back to page 53, which is in that episode back down there on Persian cosmology and religion. And it says, quote, over time, Mazdaean orthodoxy progressively hardened the dualism between the powers of Ormazd and Ahriman. And this was opposed by Zervanite theology, which seems to have developed under the Arsacids or Arsacids, although how widespread this movement became is not known. In Zervanism, In Zervanism, both Ormuzd and Ahriman are sons of Zervan, a figure who can be dated as far back as the Achaemenid period. Quote, Zervan is referred to as both time and space. So that, quote, speculations on time-space as the common source of the true principles of good and evil were familiar to the Iranians. Anyway, yeah, so there's a way that this Zervan figure as a sort of, again, the sort of origin of time and space seems to sort of go along with something that is sort of opposing, that's sort of getting out of it's non-dual in a way. What else do I want to say? It's sort of, yeah, that dualism sort of going along with good and evil as well as the duality of Ormuzd and Ahriman. Yeah. Okay, I'll just leave it and we'll go on back to what Cheetham was saying. This ahistoricism is tied to the claim that we moderns can, indeed must, make a future for the past by retrieving the past and its mythic cosmologies that are not of our time. We make it present once again, and so connect ourselves to the divine. The past is not gone, it is not past, it has not passed, it can yet be present. Okay, so I guess what he's talking about here is the idea that if we can sort of recover this sense for the eternal, what would that entail? And one thing that it would entail is sort of, quote, to make a future for the past. And so there's a way that, I guess what Corbin is getting at is that if we can get back our sense for the Gnostic, our sense for the eternal, a sense for that which is beyond space and time through gnosis in the way that's being described, that this goes along with several things. It goes along with sort of readoption of mythic cosmologies in different ways, whether or not they have to be Persian or Islamic or Sufi remains to be seen. But there's a sense that by sort of restoring, let's say through imaginal practice, our access to this sort of mythic time, that we can take the past and make it present again. And not only do we get deeper presence out of this presence in place, as per Heidegger, but we, in a way, the quality of those cosmologies and religions, the quality of them that they're past, that they're gone, becomes not true. They're in a way they're restored to presence. And so for me, it's kind of like, well, if those I'm kind of like, so what, And I'm kind of like, what about the human people? And that's kind of who I care about. And there's a way that like it's to me, it's kind of trying to find which are the cosmologies that work. Which cosmologies do we need? Um, but it's so functionalist in a way. But like anyway, I just don't really care about restoring cosmologies for their own sake. And I would sort of question why someone would. But anyway, the point is that both in this way that's being described, both past and future can be drawn out of absence and be drawn into presence. And another way of talking about that is that these mythic cosmologies are made present again. I mean, for me, I'm sort of more interested in the affordances that opens in terms of our survivability and transformation, which is again, obviously not stated in the text. As Cheetham said, the past is not gone, it has not passed. It can yet be present. Capitalized. The coordinates of the space-time of the world of matter are the coordinates of absence. In his late work, Heidegger meditated too about the structure of time in terms of presence and absence. He came to understand that past and future are both absent, but in different ways. The former, the past, refuses, while the latter withholds. Okay, classically Heideggerian way of understanding past and future. The past, there's a way that the past refuses us, whereas the future withholds itself in a way. Okay, in the context of Corbin's analysis, we can say that the spaces and times of presence, deny the refusal of the past, as well as the withholding of the future. Okay, so the idea is that sort of these qualities that Heidegger would sort of apply to our understanding, let's say, of past and future as sort of personified, well, they're undesirable. The fact that the past refuses is not good, and the fact that the future withholds is not good. And that if we, through Corbin, sort of brings this spaces and times back to presence, that we can deny those qualities, and the past doesn't have to refuse, and the future doesn't have to withhold. Sort of managing the relationships with past and future, which I think is actually a good way of putting it. It's kind of like, think of it as like past work, parts work. Imagine that the past is in fact a being. Imagine that. Imagine that the future is in fact a being that we are in relationship with. And if the past is sort of like stonewalling, and the future is sort of yeah, constantly withholding. Anyway, the idea being that through this practice we can actually sort of change the character or the quality of our relation with such um, structural features of cosmos as past and future. So that I think that would be past and future as angels through Corbin. Here too lies the deepest meaning of the significatio passiva. And so I think we understood significatio passiva through Luther, which is sort of it's like the capacity for grace in a way. It's a quality of receptivity to the theophanic vision. Okay, so what does he mean? He says, Cheetham says, by opening ourselves to the spaces of the soul, we, quote, make ourselves capable of God. Yeah, well, that definitely works out with Jung as well. It's like by practicing the capacity to take up the perspective of the soul, we sort of unlock it's unlock, I don't know, it's like it's a video game, but it's like, yeah, we become capable of sort of entheosis. All of these themes come together in a passage in which Corbin speaks of the histories related to the book, meaning the Quran. Okay, this has been taking a while, but I'm getting through it. So now we have this quote from Corbin, and then I'm getting over the page. Okay, Corbin says, if the past were really what we believe it to be, that is, completed and closed, it would not be the grounds of such vehement discussions. All our acts of understanding are so many recommencements, reiterations of events still unconcluded. Again, all our acts of understanding are so many recommencements, reiterations of events still unconcluded. Each one of us, willy-nilly, is an initiator of events in the imaginal world. Hurkalya, as he calls it. Each one of us, willy-nilly, is the initiator of events in the imaginal world, whether they abort in its hell or bear fruit in its paradise. While we believe that we are looking at what is past and unchangeable, we are in fact consummating our own future. Wow. While we believe that we are looking at what is past and unchangeable, we are in fact consummating our own future. It follows that the whole underlying metaphysics is that of an increasing, sorry, is that of an unceasing recurrence of the creation. It follows that the whole underlying metaphysics is that of an unceasing recurrence of the creation. Not a metaphysics of the ens and the esse, existence and essence, but of the esto, of being in the imperative, to be. But the event is put, or put again, in the imperative only because it is itself the iterative form of being, the iterative form of being, by which it is raised to the reality of an event. And perhaps then we shall glimpse the full gravity of a spiritual event and of the spiritual sense of events perceived in the imaginal world, when at last consciousness rediscovers the giver of what is given. Okay, so if I just briefly try and break down a couple of the implications, it's the idea that the past is actually not completed and closed in the way that we think it is. That's an illusion. And there's a way that when we understand things in that light, a closed past and a closed future in a way, there's a way that we're reiterating creation in a way which is sort of unconcluded or unfulfilled. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And that we're actually operating in the imaginal world, but unbeknownst to us. We're sort of unconscious of the way that we're participating imaginally. And so when we believe that, it is a belief, but it's more than that, it's a mode of being in the world. When we believe that what we're looking at is sort of past and unchangeable, then the future becomes that way. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so there's a way that, again, that in itself is a kind of imaginal mode, I would put. And so there's a way that creation is a sort of unceasing recurrence, but the way that it's recurring to us is that we say, oh, the past is fixed and closed, completed, and therefore the future becomes that way too. And so, but he's talking about that if we recognize that, then there's a different way of understanding being, and it's again through sort of Heidegger understanding being in the imperative, to be more, the idea that one can be more present in place, the idea that one can bring more presence into place in this imaginal way that he's describing. And that leads, if we can grasp that as an imperative, the imperative to be, then being itself becomes an iterative form. There's a sense of becoming more, right? An iterative form of being. And in that way, being itself can become a kind of event or events. And this is sort of tied to, again, stations of the soul along the way to Jungian individuation. Yeah, and so these sort of spiritual events can be, they have gravity, they have import, they have significance, and we've both been cut off from them and cut off from appreciating them, recognizing what they mean. And perhaps we will be able to do that when we, as consciousness, rediscover the giver of what is given. There's so much of profound value here. Cheetham continues, the past and the future are indeed contained within and defined by a present, the reality of which is a function of the experience of the intensity of being. given as a passion of and by the angel. Wow, I'm going to read that again. The past and the future are indeed contained within and defined by a present, the reality of which that present, the reality of that present is a function, is a function of the experience of the intensity of being given as a passion of and by the angel. What does that even mean? It's like there's a way that this the angel as intellect sort of confers, right? And it doesn't it confers passion as well as personhood in a certain way. And yeah, there's a way that that passion in the imperative to be can sort of yeah disclose more intensity of being or the experience of the intensity of being is given as that passion, and say I would say by that passion too, from in a sense from the angel. That's the claim anyway. And that intensity of being, in a way, defines the present, a present which contains past and future. And so the event of the quote, great resurrection, the parousia, Parousia. And so the event of the great resurrection, the parousia of the Paraclete, the expectation of which is in common between Islam and Christianity, and which is symbolized for Shi'ism in the person of the hidden Imam in the present time, quote, is not an event which may suddenly erupt one fine day. It is something that happens day after day in the consciousness of the Shiite faithful. So I will continue. I just wanted to clarify what's being talked about. The Perusia is a sort of arrival or coming. And so it's the idea that, yeah, so that he's pointing to this sort of commonality of this sort of mythic tradition in both Islam and Christianity, that of the sort of expectation of the return or the Perusia of the Paraclete, the Holy Ghost, to sort of descend and be among us. And I mean, this is what I would talk about as the between, or the we sense in a way, which is very much happening. And so this is what they talk about as sort of the great resurrection. And again, it's so the Perusia of the Paraclete, the return, the arrival of the Holy Ghost. And that's sort of an expectation which is common in Islam and Christianity. And in Shiism, it's symbolized by the person of the hidden Imam, or spiritual guide. And so again, then the quote from Corbin reads, that event is not an event which may suddenly erupt one fine day. It's something that happens day after day in the consciousness of the Shiite faithful. The advent to come of the Imam presupposes the metamorphosis of men's hearts. The advent to come of the Imam presupposes the metamorphosis of men's hearts. On the faith of his followers depends the progressive fulfillment of this parousia through their own act of being. On the faith of his followers depends the progressive fulfillment of this parousia through their own act of being. The parousia of the awaited Imam signifies a plenary anthropological revelation, plenary, unfolding within the man who lives in the spirit. The parousia of the awaited Imam, the return, the arrival of the awaited Imam, signifies a plenary anthropological revelation. Plenary meaning unqualified or absolute, but also of a conference, a meeting attended by all participants at a conference. I mean, that's the catalytic community. So anyway, Yeah, so again, the if I said the parousia, again, the arrival of the awaited imam signifies a plenary, an absolute, and sort of collect, I would understand collective in a way, anthropological revelation unfolding within the man who lives in the spirit. The imam has said, quote, I am with my friends wherever they seek me, on the mountain, in the plain, and in the desert. The man to whom I have revealed my essence, that is to say, the mystical knowledge of myself, has no further need of my physical proximity. And this is the great resurrection. Okay, so I have to try and unpack some of this. And so I think what I would say is sort of we've been talking about this sort of the imaginal reimagining of time and space. So the idea is that through the imaginal practice, we can sort of get back in contact with the eternal and to and realize that sort of past and future are contained within that eternal. And there's so much that's important there. I mean, I might want to record this separately. I might actually do that because I think this is like too significant to sort of be buried at the end here. So I'm going to come back and finish off pages sort of, yeah, 180 to 83 in this section. Because this is as far as I can tell one of the things that is like most centrally important in all of this. I really feel that this there are certain claims being made that sort of if true, if they can be sort of realized, could be profoundly helpful, to say the least. Um, so I'm going to come back. Stay tuned.